Bolivia has recently undergone a whirlwind of events. Elections, electoral fraud, civil revolution, and finally something that seemed impossible, the fall of Evo Morales. We're going to tell you the story of how Evo Morales went from having all of the power to giving up the presidency and even being on the run and then caught. So listen up. On October the 20th, 2019, general elections were held in the country. That night, after the results were announced, social peace exploded. Since then, the protests and demonstrations of both the opposition and the supporters of the ruling party, Evo Morales' supporters, occurred relentlessly in the country's main cities in what some call the Bolivian Spring.
The La Paz airport turned into a battlefield, a city hall devoured by flames and tear gas shot at the innumerable blocking points installed throughout the country.
The situation was so tense there was even a police riot.
Police riot against Evo Morales, who denounces a coup d'etat. The first rebel was the tactical unit of police operations in the central city of Cochabamba, and shortly after, other cities' commandos rioted.
All this is related to something we already predicted here on VisualPolitik. We told you how Evo Morales had fallen in love with power, how he'd ignored the current law in order to run for president again, and how everything indicated that he'd stop at nothing to stay in power. Even if that meant following the rule-by-force strategy that has kept characters like Nicolás Maduro, Daniel Ortega, or Juan Orlando Hernández in power. Power at any price. Well, that's exactly what happened. But having said that, let's see exactly how events unfolded in Bolivia.
A foretold story.
This whole story began on February the 21st, 2016. That day, 51% of Bolivians rejected the modification of Article 168 of the Constitution in a referendum. This constitution, which clearly prohibits the re-election of an individual for more than one term of office, was approved at Evo Morales' own request.
The president and vice president's term of office is 5 years, and he or she may only be re-elected once continuously. Article 168 of the Bolivian Constitution.
Faced with this situation, with a constitution that you yourself approved and that is so clearly laid out, and having lost a referendum to modify it, you'd probably say, okay, I respect the rules, another candidate should probably run for my party. At least that's what happens, in a country with a sort of minimal respect for the rule of law. Well, Evo wouldn't leave power. No way. And as in every country where the government has power over all the institutions, it didn't aim to work for the public good, but for the good of the government itself. Thus, in 2017, the plurinational Bolivian Constitutional Court published grotesque 0084/2017, a judgment by which articles of the Constitution itself were declared unconstitutional, which included Article 168, therefore allowing for indefinite re-elections. How? Well, yeah, let's just say welcome to Evo Morales' Bolivia. The fact is, the Constitutional Court's controversial decision was a huge blow to Bolivia's rule of law. In the end, it didn't matter what the Constitution said or what the Bolivians themselves voted for. The only thing that mattered was what Evo Morales wanted. And faced with this situation, large numbers of Bolivian society took to the streets to protest under the cry of Bolivia said no.
Bolivia dijo no! Bolivia dijo no!
But here's another question. Do you think this affected Evo Morales at all? Did it make him rethink his position or try to reach an understanding with most of Bolivia's society who had voted against his re-election? Well, no, obviously not. Evo made it clear that all he wants is power at any cost.
Por eso, hermanas y hermanos, estamos acá por un proyecto político de liberación, por un programa de gobierno del pueblo, también para la liberación, pero también para desarrollarnos.
But things did start changing at that time. The government had played fair, and they lost the referendum. So they made sure that when the time came, they wouldn't lose at the polls again. And you know what? It was a done deal. From that moment, strange, abnormal, unheard of situations began to happen. Check it out. Many members and officials of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal resigned due to the government's very strong pressure. There had been a very suspicious electoral roll increase of 190% between 2005 and 2019, a spectacular growth that evidently doesn't match the population growth for the same period of time. And things got even worse as the elections approached.
Este pueblo que está aquí en las calles está pidiendo que se respete, que este Tribunal Supremo Electoral renuncie, porque ellos no han respetado el 21F, no tenemos confianza que en las elecciones van a respetar.
The ruling party, MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism, didn't hesitate to use state resources to campaign, and of course the electoral authorities said nothing against it. Meanwhile, these same authorities were busy censoring independent surveys that didn't declare Evo Morales a winner. For example, that happened with the surveys prepared by the Higher University of San Andreas. But just a second, why would the government censor surveys? Well, just think about it for a moment. If you're going to commit fraud, you want to make sure it's not too scandalous, right? On top of that, the only company authorized to perform the quick vote count on election day was VisualPolitik, a company that's less than a year old. That sounds like a good idea, giving control of a large and complex electoral process to a newly created and inexperienced company, right? And there you have it. The road towards electoral fraud was nicely paved. So, you want to know exactly how Evo Morales stole the elections? Well, listen up.
The Great Heist.
The Supreme Electoral Tribunal, Bolivia's highest electoral authority, promised to deliver 100% of the quick count results by 8 o'clock on election night. Well, you know what happens? When the time came, the Electoral Tribunal delivered 83% of the count results, not all of them, and the electoral results broadcast was suspended without any notice or any clarification. By that time, the preliminary results marked clear trends. Evo Morales was winning in the first round with 45.28% over Carlos Mesa, the main opposition candidate, who'd obtained 38.16%. Therefore, there was only a 7.12% difference between the two candidates, which, according to Article 167 of the Constitution, would lead to a second round.
Ahora Bolivia está en la mirada de todo el mundo, como un país modelo.
You see, Article 167 of the Bolivian Constitution states that the candidate who gets 50% of the votes would be declared president. Alternatively, if a candidate gets more than 40% of the vote, with 10 points ahead of the candidate with the second highest votes, he or she can also be declared president. If these conditions aren't met, a second round must be held. A second round in which, given the results, victory wasn't quite so certain for Evo Morales. However, we've already told you that Evo wasn't willing to lose power, and what's more, he had a plan. The following day, and after more than 17 hours of unexplained suspended coverage, the fast preliminary results transmission jumped from 83% to 95%, only to be suspended again until finally, five days later, 100% of the official vote count was reached. And surprise, surprise, the results were suddenly very different. There was to be no second round because Evo had beat his rival by more than 10 points. And, well, that's when everything kicked off. Thousands and thousands of citizens began to amass in front of the Electoral Tribunal, and suspicion of fraud ran wild. No survey, no poll, nor any statistical program had foreseen such a vote deviation. A deviation at the end of the count that was completely opaque and happened amid serious irregularities in the counting process.
Porque estamos pidiendo respeto a nuestros derechos. La Corte Electoral está parcializada con estos mañudos, son unos mañudos. No nos vamos a mover de las calles, vamos a hacer respetar nuestro voto.
This is what led to protests throughout the country, protests that fundamentally demanded one thing: clean elections. As you can imagine, the government's first reaction was to try and stifle the protests through repression using the state security forces. And, well, that was that. Far from seeking a solution to the problem, what Evo did was denounce an alleged coup against him, a president who didn't hesitate to ignore his own constitution and deploy all state institutions to his personal service. Okay, so some of you might now be thinking, well, okay, Simon, but I mean, really? Was the fraud, the electoral robbery, was it really so blatant? Well, to be quite frank, yes. Practically all the independent players agree on this. For example, international organizations that acted as observers during the elections, such as the European Union or the Organization of American States, have recommended holding a second round because the official result just can't be accepted.
Every election must be governed by the principles of certainty, legality, transparency, fairness, independence, and impartiality. The mission was able to verify that several of these principles have been violated through different paths throughout this electoral process. Report from the Organization of American States Observers.
And that's not all. Even civil society members spotted a lot of irregularities. For example, there's the case of computer systems engineer Edgar Villagras, who, along with a team of professionals, has worked on comparing the official calculation tables with the results transmission. His conclusion was that the process was full of traps, which included the elimination of voting results tables to favor MAS, Evo Morales' party. And there's more. Check this out.
Bolivia. The official audit described the elections as, quote, null and void, and Carlos Mesa demanded new elections. The company hired by the Supreme Electoral Tribunal delivered a report stating that it cannot, quote, attest to the integrity of the results, end quote, of the presidential elections held last 20th of October.
As you can see, not even the company that the Electoral Tribunal itself hired, which has fully backed Evo in the past, dares to validate the results. The fraud is just too evident. And finally, the Organization of American States Observers' preliminary report was very much in the same vein. Fraud, deceit, scams, a mockery of the public will. All of this was evident. Evo Morales wanted to become a leader, just like his friends Nicolás Maduro and Daniel Ortega, who, as you all know, are experts in ignoring the democratic process.
No queremos pasar como hoy en día está pasando en Venezuela. No queremos pasar como ha pasado en Cuba. Nosotros queremos una Bolivia libre, una Bolivia digna con soberanía para nuestros hijos, para el futuro de nuestros hijos.
Anyone who's been following Bolivia's political news knows one thing. Evo Morales was going to stay in power no matter what. However, the street protesters didn't want to see Evo become a new Nicolás Maduro, and the bungling and scandalous way in which he tried to perpetrate electoral robbery meant his shot backfired. The police began to mutiny so they wouldn't have to comply with the government's repression orders, and that, along with the mass protests that were taking place in the country, led Evo to announce a call for new elections.
Convocar a nuevas elecciones nacionales que mediante el voto permitan al pueblo boliviano elegir democráticamente a sus nuevas autoridades.
But was the same person who committed the fraud going to organize and stand for election again? What credibility would that process have? Merely repeating the elections? It was no longer enough. The people on the streets, the opposition parties, the independent media, all the forces outside MAS had begun demanding the president's resignation. And finally, the army followed suit.
No, que es la mejor decisión que ha tomado.
In fact, that was the last straw. Without the people, without the police, and without the army, Evo Morales was forced to hand in his resignation and resign from Bolivia's presidency.
Bolivia's Morales resigns amid scathing election report, rising protests.
But just a second, because the drama doesn't end there. This is what followed.
Evo Morales travels to Mexico on a plane owned by the López Obrador government.
And so that's how Evo Morales' time in Bolivia came to an end. After his departure, the new transition government has announced a call for new elections that will be supervised by international organizations. Now fine, the procedure may not have been the best, but Bolivian democracy was at stake. Evo would have had to leave, but he got drunk with power and decided to turn Bolivia into his own personal playground. Of course, it doesn't end there. Bolivia now faces not only a deep institutional conflict, but also significant economic imbalances. Evo's most recent years were really bad, and the future is far from clear. The country needs a complete change of course. We're going to talk about that in an upcoming video. So now it's your turn. Do you think Evo's departure will be good for Bolivia? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, as well as in this survey. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. And don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that weren't mine. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
No queremos pasar como hoy en día está pasando en Venezuela. No queremos pasar como ha pasado en Cuba. Nosotros queremos una Bolivia libre, una Bolivia digna.